Hi everyone, we're very pleased to welcome you tonight to the second event of the Now What series. As James was mentioning, tonight's event's title is Rethink and Practice, and it is an evening where we've set to discuss the values of alternative forms of practice. These are forms of practice that engage with the built environment through multidisciplinary routes, and which we feel that often are much more able to deal or to raise, to bring to the table the urgencies of our time in manners that feel very honest and transparent, more so than other traditional forms of practice that we're more used to seeing. We're really lucky to be joined by three brilliant speakers tonight. Hani, Thomas and Namara are designers and architects, and we were very inspired, even if they're all young, or maybe especially because they're young, we're inspired by them because we feel that they're all laying down a base for forms of practice that are critical of the way we engage with the city and with architecture, and that are really sort of opening new paths for the way we engage with the communities that our projects affect, and the way we engage with each other within our professions. So the way the evening is going to run, as James was mentioning, is that each of the speakers will present themselves and some of their work and reflections about practice for 15 minutes, and after that we will open to the public. And the first speaker I'd like to introduce is Hani. James, you might have to meet him.
Yeah, I've got that.
Great.
Okay, right. Can you hear me? Okay, first thing I want to say, I'm not an architect. If anyone in here is working with the RIBA or for the RIBA, please let me acknowledge that. I don't want a cease and desist letter. I guess I can get the ball rolling. So I will, let me just share my screen. Is that visible? Is everyone?
That's good.
Okay, cool. All right, so I'm just gonna make sure my timer is on. I will stick to 10 minutes. So hi everyone, welcome. My name's Hani. I am co-founder and co-director of Migrant's Bureau. And yeah, for this first kind of like 10 minutes, I'm just gonna run you through what we do and why we do it and how we do it. Well, I'll try to keep it as open as possible to make sure that we can kind of have a conversation about it. So yeah, we are Migrant's Bureau. This is our lovely team. You know, all of us are kind of brought together by this understanding of the importance of being kind of migratory, and we talk about it from the perspective of both culture and geography. And so we don't just think about it as kind of going from country A to country B. We think about it as the kind of influences and the aspects of how that feeds into your kind of identity, but also then how that feeds into how you see the world and how you interpret it. So I'm just gonna move on. So this is kind of what our main claim. You know, this is kind of our strapline. We talk about how essentially through this understanding of the local and the migrant, through this kind of mediation of different cultures and different aspects of identity, we think that gives us an interesting and unique perspective to consider aspects of culture and geography and social circumstances in different societies and communities. And so as a result, we kind of use that as a lens as a kind of a way in to curate, design and facilitate sustainable interventions, experiences and services for translocal and global communities. And, you know, more on that later. But before we get into it, I think it's really important for us to, just before we kind of get further into discussion, for us, we like to make sure that we kind of understand where we're at in terms of terminology that we use. So when we talk about disenfranchised, I think a lot of people would have heard that word, especially given the kind of the events of the last couple of years, specifically kind of these social movements have kind of been bubbling to the top. And the idea of, you know, being disenfranchised is essentially kind of the systemic relegation of certain members of communities based on aspects of their kind of identity, their race, their religion, their faith. It could be, you know, a broad range of things that kind of define you, who you are, or kind of are projected onto you. And so when we talk about being disenfranchised, we don't necessarily just refer to just the obvious kind of aspect of disenfranchisement. And this touches on ideas of oppression and power that we will talk about later as well. I think we'll probably more in the conversation later. And then when we say migrant as well, one thing we want to emphasize is that we don't just mean people. We mean other aspects of kind of like nature, bodies, spaces, animals. And really, again, it's about the notion of not being anchored in one place, but also being able to negotiate different socio-cultural environments. And so, yeah, that's not something that we think is restricted only to people. And even that word migrant is actually quite politically, it has a lot of connotations, which we can argue about, Anyway, so these are kind of our main values. And I'm not going to like sit here and read them all out, but I think that the main thing is to highlight is the kind of the main action points of what each of these values mean. You know, we're trying to kind of actively empower more Black-led design, architecture, and landscape practices and environmental practices. We try to kind of think a little bit more about discourse and how we can use it as a way to be kind of central to our practice, but also central to getting people involved with our conversations as well. We think about using different ways, different practices and we try to be interdisciplinary as possible. And I think within the team that we've got, you know, that I showed you, there's a few of us who have architectural backgrounds, but a few of us who don't. And we really cherish that as part of our approach to thinking about problem solving and thinking about how we make places for communities and people. And as a result, also we think about inclusivity and participation with design, as well as obviously history of land policy and research. And again, more on that later if anyone's interested in having that discussion. And again, consider methods of working across defined disciplines. So this sometimes doesn't just mean thinking about who we have on the team, but also how we can involve other people in the team as well. And again, more on that later. I think the best way to really illustrate this is just to kind of take you through a few of our projects to try to kind of show you what this looks like in practice. So a lot of you may probably, who have heard of us or have heard of our work, will be very familiar with gender equity in cities. So this is a project that we did in 2018, which already feels like a scary amount of time ago. And we kind of, this came out of a conversation within our regular kind of monthly internal meetings that we have, where we discuss wider aspects of society, wider aspects of experience or cultural identity, to kind of make sure that we're constantly bringing that to our conversations. And so this came out of that organic conversation, and it was really just a project that's set to look at, well, it was born out of a conversation that was asking about how does your perspective as someone in the city change how you experience and perceive the city. And so some of the conversations that we had really reflected that. And, you know, this was essentially part, like I said, it was part of London Design Festival. It was a design and build and also conference project. So we designed and built the structure in time for the 5-day program that we had planned. And on the first day we had this conference, we held, I think, something like 5 or 6 panels. Each of them looked at different aspects of what it means to be a different type of person in the city, and how that affects and how that kind of affects how you experience the city, but also how you see it and how you navigate it. So, you know, we talked about, one of the things we talked about was child-friendly cities, which is an interesting discussion about how can designing child-friendly cities actually make the space more inclusive. What does a child-friendly city look like? We talked about, you know, women in architecture and their experiences in practice, but we also then talked about things like transport policy and how that can potentially help improve upward social mobility, loneliness in cities. We talked about, what else did we talk about? We talked about a lot of things. We talked about LGBTQ spaces in the city, and also how does that affect how you navigate the city. Obviously, in such certain contexts, this is something that's a bigger problem than others. But again, that was part of the conversation. And as part of this program, you know, we even had, we didn't just use the space as a central point for discussion, but we also had like smaller workshops throughout the week to make sure that the space was active. So really kind of started to highlight how for us, it's not about the built space itself, rather what does the space provide? What does the space give opportunity for, and what does it facilitate? And again, for us, the main thing that we try to do is how do we become facilitators and enablers rather than dictators or, like, you know, directors. More recently, you know, we started another project which kind of is more about knowledge exchange. So this is a collective supper club. This is a project that we started back in 2020, and it's much more about how can we bring people together who have a similar mission or have similar intentions, but how can we give them the opportunity to be able to kind of share information, share skills, share knowledge in a way that kind of helps people overcome barriers that they may not be able to get access to. For example, like certain aspects of information or experience you might not get because you don't have specific mentors, or you might not have specific access to people who have experiences that have already gone through that. So Collective Supper Club was a really good point for us to try and think about how can we, again, facilitate this conversation, a wider conversation about how do we kind of start to think about how do we deconstruct racist systems or institutions, and how can we then collectivize it in some way or another. And, you know, this happened in January 2020, and it was a really great event, but obviously, as you all know, while we're all on Zoom, I'm not going to say it, but something happened. And you know, one of the things that we've been trying to do is also think about how can we continue this conversation, how can we continue this dialogue within the context of this kind of slightly more distant society. And you know, we've started doing these kind of smaller versions of these on Zoom, which are like breakfast editions. But we're really looking forward to, I mean, we're bringing that back and bringing the idea of kind of networking, bringing people together still. But we're really looking forward to bringing that back as well in the future, hopefully when all this is kind of easier to navigate. And to continue this idea. But again, we're not trying to be restricted by limits of physical presence, at least in this context. And one of the things that we also, again, that highlighted in the values is the idea of using discourse and discussion as a way to kind of keep conversations going and understand where we can go next. And the MD podcast, which was originally the 3x9 podcast, sprung out of that, you know, out of the understanding of like, we want to continue a lot of these really interesting conversations that came out of the Gender Equity Cities project, but we you know, we need to do that in a way that's also much more accessible for people who weren't either able to be there on the day, or people who might want to have specific access issues that they weren't able to maybe hear on the day because it was outside or anything like that. And so the podcast served as a really interesting way for us to continue that conversation, and that's something we've been actively doing in this kind of more recent run of the podcast as well. We've been, you know, for example, in the first episode on the left, we talked about what it means for us each individually to be a migrant. In the episode in the middle, Ishwari led an episode where she talked to Andrea Lucas Zimmerman, who's a filmmaker, and she talked about like the idea of like how does housing and how does the process of gentrification and process of change within housing in a specific context that she made a really fantastic film about, how does that affect people. And then in the more recent episode, Bola sat down and spoke with Dr. Harriet Harris, and it was a wonderful, wonderful conversation about just systems and just so much. It's actually kind of informationally very overwhelming. I know I only have 1 minute, but I'm actually at the end of my presentation. So I guess all of you are asking, so what? You know, what is this? And you know, like, why is this important? And I think in an ideal world, this would be something that would, like, our approach to kind of centering the community and thinking about how can we take a position as facilitators would be a given, right? But unfortunately, we're in a world where we have to kind of try to navigate the world through these kind of very fixed perspectives and fixed ideas of what it means to be a designer, an architect, or a facilitator. We don't call ourselves architects. We think of ourselves as community facilitators. If we're going to use the word architect, we sometimes say we are community architects. Again, anyone who is in here who's RIBA, we're not actually claiming that we are like architects. So, but yeah, I think I'm going to leave it there. I'm looking forward to having conversations and kind of answering questions from people as they come in. And yeah, that's us.
Amazing. Thanks so much, and thanks so much for sticking to time so precisely. Next in the presentations would be Amara.
Hi everybody. There we go. Good evening everyone. I hope you're all really well. I'm going to try and share my screen, and that was a masterful timekeeping job you just did, so good luck everybody, because I don't know where this is going to go, but I'll try my best. So hi, my name's Amara Spence, equally definitely not an architect. I am an artist, I'm a spatial practitioner, and a cultural producer. In 2013 I co-founded with a dear friend of mine Maya, which is an art and social justice organisation. And if I can talk about our vision really quickly, because we believe that it's possible that we could see a world where artists are seen as powerful decision makers, both in terms of how structures and systems work, but also the idea that, you know, the manifestations of systemic change can actually be recognised as art. And if we talk about our mission, we really want to define what being an artist actually means and challenge who gets to make their dreams real, and fundamentally invest in the transformative possibilities of the radical Black imagination. I've been thinking a lot about what brought me to this work, what brought me to spatial practice, and it's impossible for me to do that without talking about Boys in the Hood, which was the first time I ever heard the word gentrification. Thank you to Lawrence Fishburne, who became my idol. In fact, where I grew up in the hood, everyone was like, you know somebody like Furious Styles. And so when Furious Styles was speaking about gentrification, I started to understand that there was a politics to land and space, and there was a vocabulary for it and how that played out in the displacement of poor and Black people. That really struck me. And so I think a lot about how a lot of Black cinema classics if we think about Friday as a spatial practice film, which my dear friends Seth and Akhil from Resolve highlighted, you know, this idea that a lot of our artistic works of excellence are actually spatial practice projects. So I tend to think in that sort of framing. And then from then, I am the biggest hip hop nerd. I'm a child of the grime era. And to me, I really understand that those genres, I think about them as social critiques of their environment. You know, I think about I'm trying to watch my language, but the very poor planning and policy decisions and built environment decisions that led to inequitable housing, that necessitated the birth of hip hop, of grime. If I think about the estates, if I think about Sedgwick Avenue and the projects which birth these architectures and therefore the genres, I became really interested in this idea, well, how could we take the art form and create something revolutionary, create something that was speaking about possibilities and not deficit and not pain and not suffering. And that space is important too. And hip hop has been an incredible, now global channel for pain and suffering. But I really wanted to see, how do we birth really bold imaginations through hip hop. And so I designed a project called Beats, Rhymes and Cities, where we work with a beat maker, a rapper and an illustrator as facilitators. And they work with communities who basically, we're working with each facilitator to generate data. What does spaces for joy look like within our context? And how do we extract that data and work with generative design to produce hip-hop responsive architectures, grime responsive architectures that are actually speaking about liberation and liberated spaces instead. And I've been delivering this project with 6-year-olds. I've been delivering it with community elders, and it's incredible. So we basically 3D print these hip hop responsive architectures, and we map out a city, and suddenly we've got people from the hood speaking about urban planning and architecture in a way that, you know, we're told that we haven't got the license to talk about those things. Yet here we've got 6-year-olds who are talking about master plans in a really, really radical and intentional way, in a language that makes sense to them. So it's been a dream project of mine to do that. But there is something that feels really important to mention about the extraction of value, the extraction of culture, and how, particularly through something as globalized as hip hop, and as something as sort of national as grime, that how there is this extraction in which our cultures can be lifted at the complete disregard of our bodies, of our autonomy, and particularly how that plays out in the public realm. So a few years ago, I was working with SBTV. We did a project in Birmingham, which is where I'm based, and we got like all of these people in this tiny little pre-COVID days, this tiny little like empty shop front, and we were working with the developer of this site to make this happen. And it was a gorgeous day, like it was like 25 degrees, it was hot, like it was such a good vibe, it was sunny. It's in an area called Digbeth, particularly in an area where there are lots of other there are organisations that work around there in units. And it was incredible. They came down, they ate with us, they jammed with us, we had a radio station, it was all incredible. And at the end of the day, the developers came up to me and my colleague, my co-worker, and said, if I brought my nan here, if I'd brought my mom here, she'd have been really uncomfortable. And I was thinking, what is it about Black bodies in public space that makes you feel uncomfortable? You know, I think we were invited to produce something with SBTV. You know who the audience is, you know what this is about. What is it about peaceful Black bodies that makes you uncomfortable? And that's something that I really want us to sit with more in our interrogations of the public realm and spatial practice. And so I've always been really passionate about space for liberation. How do we create healing infrastructure? How do we create spaces for joy? How do we create, how do we embody that spirit sort of, and how can the built environment be part of that relationship in embodying peace and joy? And I was really inspired by Trisha Hersey, who runs the Nap Ministry. If you haven't heard of the Nap Ministry, go follow it and then take a nap. The Nap Ministry is on Instagram and on all sorts of social media platforms. But essentially what that's a call to is saying that as Black people, our ancestors have worked for centuries under all sorts of oppressive forces, not only do we deserve to rest, but actually rest is a radical force of resistance. Reclaim your time. On top of that, if we don't rest, we can't dream. And if we don't dream, we haven't got the capacity to think beyond the paradigm that we exist within. So with that sort of thought, we at Maya, we created Reparations, which is the nap installation, which is very much about reclaim your dream time, your energy space, your healing time, just have a nap. And that was gorgeous. Like we just had loads of people napping together, which I'm always for. But there is something that feels really pertinent about needing to have spaces that aren't just economically sustainable. They need to stand up and be able to keep the doors open. They have to be spiritually sustainable. They have to be able to accommodate what we mean by healing infrastructure. How does that impact the materials that we use, the financial sources with which we're in relationship with? How does it, how do we bring artists into that process to design what physical spaces should be? And at this, well, I was going to say the start of last year, in March when the pandemic hit, sorry to bring up that word, we acquired the keys for a 4-bedroom house, and in which we turned into an art house and a residency space. And actually that's the first phase of a really ambitious plan where we're creating an artist-led hotel. And the hotel is sort of a moniker for something that we're using to represent something much broader than a hotel. I think there's something that's really common in spaces that are created by working class people and by Black people in particular, is that the spaces that we create have to become 1,000,001 things. So like in my community, we've got like Caribbean takeaways that become the social surgeries, they become childcare for a time. If you want help packing your groceries, someone will come out of the shop and help you. That the independent shops on our high streets become sort of social infrastructures of their own. And here's my 4-year-old asking about his sweets. Of course you can. So that our spaces become social infrastructures and social centres and community centres in all of the ways. So the hotel is essentially a large-scale community centre with which you can sleep at, but that doesn't sound as sexy as an artist-led hotel. and then so the question about that was we need something to be on site within our community. We were really adamant from the beginning that we didn't want to birth this thing in the city centre. Birmingham is an incredibly centralised city, so we knew that we needed infrastructure in a place that has been disinvested in over a long period of time. And then you're trying to then compete with the pace of the private sector. So the second that we found a site, we found a developer who was into the long-term relationship with us, things started to get a bit competitive. So we said, can we be on site really quickly? Can we work with our community? Can we be proximate to what's happening? And can we make a bit of noise and a bit of glamour with what we're developing? So Yard became our phase 1 for what this project is, which has enabled us to do all sorts of things. We've got a gorgeous community kitchen. So over the period of lockdown, where like I say, all the local hustlers were, I don't know about you, but they were like selling boil bags and stuff over Snapchat, or like wings with the parsley on them and all that kind of stuff. So we said, okay, I see what you're doing on Snapchat, but can we help you get legit? Do you need your health and safety hygiene certificates? Like, what do you need? How can Yard become a resource that reinvests back into those really material needs? And how can you then scale up your business, and how can we use Yard in that sort of regenerative way? What are all the other things that we can birth through that? And I'm happy to talk a bit more about that later if it comes to it. But I just really wanted to leave with this final point about lineages. So in 2020, in June, sort of at the height of the uprisings after George Floyd's murder, as Colston statue was being torn down in Bristol, it felt like in the UK we were having a conversation about the public realm, and critically about race in a way that we never had done before. And it felt like the really poignant time to launch the Black Land and Spatial Justice Project. So I started that with a campaign to raise £30,000 to invest in transformative actions around the land and space, and people who have been practicing in and around land and space for a really long time. But there's something about lineages that feels really important to name here and to honour. And I kind of the spaces that we're creating with Maya, what feels really important is we're not trying to create from the precedents that exist in our sector as we know it. We're not trying to recreate a white cube gallery. We're not trying to create a theatre or an auditorium as in a traditional sense. We're trying to honour the spirit of our ancestors in a way that they have done really intentionally. So what does it mean to create, you know, a spirit of our grandfathers' homes, which in my case has been a source of joy and a source of regeneration in my family and in our community. This idea of lineages is we know that people have always been organising through oppression, through violence, and through harm. And if we can look at the history of sort of community land trusts and understand that, you know, African American people established community land trusts simply to create a safe space for themselves. If we think about the maroon communities in Jamaica and how they established a relationship with land and space out of survival. If we think about Haitian revolutionaries, formerly enslaved people who created radical architectures in swamplands in the southern states of the United States. If we think about the Windrush generation and the economic models that they had to create and the sort of like co-housing models that they had to create out of survival to be in this country, we understand that there's a lineage. So the Black Land and Spatial Justice Project really wants to honour that and acknowledge that there are a continued generation of people who are creating through that lens of even through oppression and hardship, we are creating, liberating, empowering things. And I'm gonna stop there now because I've got loads more to say, but there's a conversation to be had.
Thank you so much. That was incredible. And I almost wish you didn't have to stop at all and you could just carry on forever. But I'll pass it on to Thomas now, and we will definitely have the conversation later.
Thanks.
Yeah, sorry.
Let me just get this up. Thanks, Lucia. And thanks for your invitation to be part of this conversation. It is not easy to follow Amhara. That was an exceptional and really spirited set of ideas, and massive respect to you and to Hani. I also want to recognize both James and Lucia in the initiative of setting up the Now What series. So respect to you both. I practice more traditionally for Ajay Associates as a designer and researcher. In 2019, I coordinated and led the design of this blockbuster exhibition, David Ajay Making Memory, at the Design Museum, attended by over 31,000 people over 6 months. I hope some of the audience have managed to see this exhibition. I also practice as a tutor for new architecture writers. This is a pedagogical project that seeks to address underrepresentation in architectural criticism and writing. I participated in the inaugural cohort of this program in 2017 and have since become tutor and more recently co-director of new architecture writers. And I do this alongside Tom Wilkinson and with the Architecture Foundation, in particular, Rosie Gibbs Stevenson, who, as I understand, had helped set up MAS in the first place when she was a student at London Met. So here in this image from 2019, we held a public debate called Drawing the Edge to the Center. And this was long before COVID-19 pandemic rules of distancing, as already touched on by both Hani and Amara. And then third, I practice with...
Thomas, you're still on the Ajay Associates image, is that right?
Oh no. Really?
Yes, I'm not sure if...
Just take a moment.
Take a moment, that's good.
Okay, and apologies again, Sufan, for my idea to go PDF and not go PowerPoint. Okay, here we go. Take 2 of Now What? Rethinking Practice. I think I was initially here. This is my practice with Ajay Associates. followed by my practice as a tutor for new architecture writers. I think I'd mentioned that this is a pedagogical project that seeks to address underrepresentation in architectural criticism and writing. And James had identified that when I said here in this image, it wasn't shown earlier, but in this image, we held a public debate called Drawing the Edge to the Center. And this is long before COVID-19 rules of socialization. And then third, I am also a co-founder of After Party, a writing and curation collective driven by a manifesto to foster spatial equity in the built environment. And hopefully that connects with some of the ideas spoken about by both Hani and Amara. This is my After Party family. From left to right, we have Nal Bridgman, Marwa Al-Mubarak, Shukri Sultan, Tara Okeke, Ari Phillips, Sufan Adi, Josh Fenton, and Samson Famusan. And at the core of our collective project is the publishing of an eponymous zine and organizing of public events. Our first zine, launched in 2019, was based on the provocation, "The time for failure is now." And just before lockdown, a little over a year ago, we hosted this sellout event at the Barbican, based on the theme for the love of power. And here I am on stage, or rather sharing a stage, with Marwa Al-Mubarak, Adam Elliott Cooper, Julia King, and Andre Anderson. But reflecting about tonight's title, it made me think about the idea of practice and critically about my own evolution and my own positionality. This made me think, rather this made me change my originally planned talk about the practice of writing and of organizing and of publishing. Instead, I want to talk to you tonight about the practice of walking. And I apologize that my talk up to this point hasn't been as smooth as that transition. Conceptually, I've been drawn to this notion of walking for some time, the lure of something so simple, undefined by class or income. And walking has, for me, become a sort of methodological tool that I use to read and write cities. I've come to realize that the practice of walking is closely related to architecture. Walking as a form of self-locomotion requires sharp attention to spatial proximities. And inspired by the work of sociologist Suzanne Hall and essayist Garnet Cadogan, I've come to think of walking as power and privilege, as well as at times an oppressive negotiation. So I believe that walking is one of the ways that we can closely observe the specificities of context and form to create an architecture that is deeply embedded in its place. I started to think about this a while ago when carrying out fieldwork for a dissertation I wrote at the University of Edinburgh. And here my writing in my dissertation, "The Street That Opens Onto Somewhere," was an attempt at a street level description of Mau Mau Road in Nairobi. Through a series of interviews on the street, I became interested in how people hold themselves and I suppose how they pass through it or pass through the built environment. The project made me think that it wasn't just about my movement through the city, but it was also about understanding how other people move as well. So this attitude shifted, or rather developed, and it expanded into a project where I was the 6th RIBA Norman Foster Traveling Scholar, and in my project, Material Economies, where I conceived and documented original research on the reappropriated architectures in these 6 cities: Cairo, Addis Ababa, Kampala, Kigali, Lusaka, and Johannesburg. And before I continue, I just want to make sure that you're seeing these 6 cities. Okay, great. Okay, great. So in these places, walking is critically important, as much of urban life takes place on the street, where work and networks are shared and frequently rely on taking into account the most minute details. And then looking more closely at one of these 6 cities, my later project, Loose Fit Infrastructures, delved into the dynamics of physical movement across downtown Kampala. Kampala is an East African capital with a modestly sized city of about 2 million residents, with this natural topography of hills and valleys. And my research had focused mainly on this disused railway line. And so whilst we see there a freight wagon, this railway line that sort of bisects the downtown city is largely an absent space, or rather it's perceived by authority to control as sort of an absent space. But what we see here is the physical remnants of colonialism are repurposed by a sort of temporary vegetative and human occupancy. Street vendors, kiosk businesses, urban farmers and commuters gravitate towards this railway corridor, which I think of essentially as a slow-moving market space. And so, in a way, what we have is a space in the city that is sort of an interstitial zone. Downtown has developed around this large railway reserve, if you like, a crumbling urban obstacle to be navigated and built around. But I appreciate that at this point, since I'm speaking for the London Met tonight, if I wasn't in my bedroom, if I wasn't struggling with my use of Zoom, I'd probably be in Aldgate East. And walking Whitechapel High Street. A version of an essay I wrote last year was published in the Alternative Guide to the London Boroughs, as published by Open House. So I want us just to think back to the heat of July last year. And here I was, at this moment, just the act of walking feels like a subtle protest. The street encourages me to let go of tension, or tensions that have built up from being inside. I'm disconnected from the digital world and reconnecting with the basic rhythms of breathing. So little did I know then that I'd still be rather immobile and back here in my bedroom a year later. But let's begin with your old school campus. Once a textile factory, then turned into the London Met's Sir John Cass School of Art, Architecture and Design, and now or then tightly veiled in muted grey, preparing for its redevelopment into commercial offices. I loved how in its sort of camouflage state, there was no sign of 2015, 6 years ago, when students and staff staged that lock-in demonstration against this displacement. But as I understand, even in your new home, a few blocks away at Calcutta House, controversy has still followed. That former monarch, Sir John Cass, has been dethroned, I suppose part of his prominent figure in the Atlantic slave trade. Across the road, there were these freshly wheat-pasted murals intervening to remind us that Black Lives Matter in a renewed struggle for racial equality. Further along is Altab Ali Park. I love this space. Named after the 25-year-old Bengali tailor who was murdered in this space by racists in 1978. The park has since become a place, a site for Muslim activism. And I think it's like an archaeological ruin with this raised terrazzo walkway that marks the partial outline of the once medieval Whitechapel, bombed out in the Blitz in 1940. And then here we find the sort of contemporary debris of crisis. This sort of, if you like, visual carousel of the high street, bodies, buildings, posters, signage, shop fronts, all having to improvise with this ongoing pandemic. And even sort of the edges of the park, where hazard tape marks sort of our movement. And I suppose when you move through Whitechapel High Street, it is a sort of an artery, this main artery, but it is also a place of incredible migrant spirit and migrant community. So for me, I wrote these words, and I think they still stand today, and hopefully a reminder as we walk through empty high streets, that if anything, the high street is a place to learn from people with powerful survival skills. Resilience is, after all, something migrant communities carry and refashion with regularity. The rich array of cultural necessities and global services serve the local population of residents, signaling their Bangladeshi heritage, as well as their significant Somali, Caribbean, Chinese, Vietnamese, Indian, Pakistani communities. This is a place that the world has come to. And if we keep going along Whitechapel High Street, we arrive here at this shell of a building. This is the former Royal London Hospital, and is now part of this prolonged conversion into a new civic centre. To me, it creates a sort of spatial metaphor of both brokenness and repair. If we move beyond the next interchange, and some of you might know this, but the road changes name from Whitechapel High Street to Mile End Road. And at this point, the street expands with clearly defined tree-lined avenues, punctuated by busts, a series of colonial reminders, just in case we need them. We could keep walking, but I also feel like this is an appropriate marker and a good place to end. I've also probably gone beyond my allotted time, not least because I had a 3-minute practice run. But at this point, I think it's important to recognize that this experience, my experience of walking, is not available to everyone. And I'd like you, the audience, to reflect on your embodied practice and your engagement with the city. What does it mean to create a more equitable city? Recent events have shown that the city is not equitable, for example, for women walking at night. But I do hope that my remarks tonight have helped us think about a slightly more nuanced way to see mobility as important to understanding any architectural mandate. Walk far, often, and observant. Thanks very much.
Thank you so incredibly much for that talk, Thomas, and to all three of you, really. They've all been incredible and very, very beautiful and very reflective. And I think they all hold, they all hold truths of the moments that we're living in that sometimes are easy to forget because we don't word them enough, or we don't discuss them enough now that we're trapped in our homes and we don't see other people so much, or we only see them for work or tutorials. But that I'm very delighted to hear you talk about. We're now going to open the floor to questions, and everyone is very welcome to post them on the chat. But I'd like to start with a reflection. It kind of stems from something that Amara was saying but I think ties into what all of you speakers have mentioned, which is about how sometimes, or about having the right to address changes in the city and feeling like we've got that right because we have a certain title or we know certain forms of speech. And it almost ties in quite well with my mistake at the beginning of the talk where I introduced you as architects, but in fact, neither of you are, and that's the value of it, that you don't have to be architects. Almost, some of you almost are, but that that you don't have to be architects to be able to have an effect in a spatial environment. And so when Amara was mentioning how certain terminologies you learn, and when you learn them, you feel like you're able to speak about them, and you feel like you've got the power to be part of certain conversations. And I suppose in those cases, language becomes a barrier and becomes something that is quite, that you need to acquire in order to be part of a forum. But that, as Thomas was talking, and as I think we saw as well with Hani's work, that in fact this language is not really necessary. That a lot of the people that we see in the high streets and we see in our cities know all of these things without knowing the words with which to address them. And I wanted to start by asking a question, which is, how do you bridge these two worlds of the people who know the words but don't always? And I speak for myself, I learn these words because I read them in essays or I study them in university, but I don't have a lot of the knowledge that a lot of these people have of what living in the real world is. How do you become bridge between these two things?
I don't know if I'm going to answer your question, but your question has certainly flagged up some really key things for me. This piece about language. So one of the reasons why I set up the Black Land and Spatial Justice Project is because I'm a philosophy nerd, and I came to realize how wrapped up our legal system, our property system, and all of the industries and institutions that have emerged from property have been rooted in ideologies from philosophers like John Locke. John Locke is, in the UK, he's identified as like the father of liberalism. I wanted to flag that because he was a person who theorized that any man who has the right to, any man who works on the land has the right to own it. Any man who works on the land has the right to own it. At the time that he was developing such theories, he was rooting them in legal rights, in divine rights, and assign that to property. At the time that he was developing those frameworks, he was directly invested in chattel slavery. He was one of the biggest investors in the transatlantic slave trade at the time of his writing. He was directly active in the dehumanization of African people who were then stripped from their humanity and turned into property, and property cannot own property. So it's no surprise that our language, our legal system, and everything that we know about property and land is harmful to a lot of people because we weren't supposed to ever have access to. Industries and systems have been designed to maintain that distance from accessing land and property. So I think that when we're talking about language, to remind ourselves that it is really intentionally disconnected, that the academy's role is in maintaining that status quo for a very specific reason. And I think if I can flag up one of the most incredible texts that helped me explore this further was The Aesthetics of Equity by Dr. Craig L. Wilkins. And I think that that's just an incredible text to explore that further. But the idea that that our academies and our institutions are directly responsible for also maintaining that the language oppression and the practice.
Can I just follow on from that? Maybe in a slightly more, just in a quite a direct way, how I think particularly through new architecture writers, we're trying to do something which is about creating visibility where there's typically been invisible, where voices have been typically invisible. And I think one of the reasons why new architecture writers is such a important space is that it's trying to address underrepresentation in architectural criticism and writing. And why is that important? Well, that's because it's not just about who's designing the buildings, that needs to be from a more diverse background, from a more diverse pool of people, but also the way that we read about cities is also really critical. And that the language of what we read is really important. And I think, therefore, it's about understanding how if you can diversify and expand the language effectively, that we might create a slightly more nuanced and subtle characterization of what an architectural mandate might be. And you know what? Sorry. What I just wanted to say is that, we've just started a new cohort with another 9 members. And so what's amazing about NAW is we now have, almost 30 past members or in total alumni of the program. And that allows for, hopefully, an expansion of, and we started to see that, I think, with all the members writing in all kinds of magazines.
I think just to touch on what Amara said, I think what Amara is mentioning is really important. I think one of the things that we need to, and what we're trying to do with Migrants Bureau, a lot of the time what we try to do is try to understand why things are shaped the way they are. Why are institutions working in the way that they are? And we always question, what are the incentives? What are the reasons? What are the history behind that? And like Amara was saying, a lot, you don't have to go very far back to realize that there is this history of kind of systemic thinking about how do we keep a certain group away from managing power or gaining power, and how do we manage to keep another group sort of more invested or more kind of able to leverage their own social or economic capital. So when it comes to language, that's one thing that we like to really try to think about, and I think that's one of the things we're thinking about internally is how can we make access to frameworks and systems truly accessible. So we have to think about what kind of words we use. We have to think about how we use them. And that's something that we consciously try to do especially when we speak to communities, when we facilitate with communities. So you have to think, when you go into positions where you're trying to serve a client or a customer, or to use those phrases is also another way to think about it. But if you're working for a community, you think about your practice. You don't come in and just say, okay, I'm going to tell you what to do. You have to come in willing for it to be a conversation. And in that conversation, you also have to be aware of the privileges that you bring into that position. And how does your privilege and how does your association to privilege affect how much space you take up? And then once you then start to understand that, you can understand how then you can, again, continue to become a facilitator. It's never really about sort of being dictator in the traditional conventional sense of what an architect may kind of have been idolized to be. So that's kind of what we think about when we think about rethinking practice. It's we have to try to build new frameworks internally and externally to facilitate that. And it's not an easy process, of course, because again, like Amara was saying, there's systems that have been in place for a very long time that are very good at doing what they do and very good at divesting or moving money around, and we just have to try and find the loopholes.
Hani, on language, can you just sort of help define that term that you use, translocal?
Mm-hmm. So we basically mean across, within a local context, but across that local context. So we don't. So we talk about global and translocal. So that's essentially the two scales that we're talking about. We're talking about the larger scale, but also within the scale of a region or a city or a regional context.
Thanks very much. That's really good. I'm going to open up the questions to the audience. I've had a few come in. Also, if you're feeling good. You can also show your video so that we can see you. It's nice to have a few people visible in discussion, so it's not just us six kind of talking to, yeah, it's just nice to see everyone. But anyway, so the question I've had is from Precious, and I'm going to invite her to read out the question. Precious, are you there? Let me just ask to unmute you now.
Hey.
Oh,
so my question is particularly for Hani, but I'm pretty sure all of you can answer it. First of all, massive thank you for all your presentations. I really enjoyed them. My question is there something like very special and specific about the temporality of your projects? Is there something that happens in the kind of the constriction of time that enables a conversation that can't happen in spaces that focus on longer term conversations like universities? Is there something very specific other about being like a week or a month-long project that allows an intensity of conversation that you don't get in these longer term spaces?
That's a good question. I think for us, whenever we think about projects, what we want to do is we have to maximize the potential social positive impact of a project. And so while it is good to have like these kind of, like you're saying, like you're describing, these temporal conversations, it is really important to make sure we continue those as not only as practice, but also as conversation, because otherwise it just becomes this kind of drop in, drop out situation. And so with a lot of our projects, we really try to maintain some level of legacy in that. So for the Gender Equity in Cities conference, that was a five-day project, but actually afterwards we had the podcast as a way of continuing those conversations, and now those conversations live on through specific themes and topics that you find in some of the projects we're doing right now. And then in terms of the actual physical structure itself, that's, and we've managed to kind of like find a new home for the timber to be reused in an adventure playground in Hackney. So it's the Shakespeare Walk playground, adventure playground. So there's what we try to do is that, yes, we have these conversations, yes, these things happen, but it's not really just about like the temporality of it. And yes, we do have really interesting conversations that can take place in short periods of time, but that's not like the main focus. The main focus is just to ensure that there is a legacy, because again, we try to be very aware of how we position ourselves and how much space we take up, and then what happens when we leave that space, which I think sometimes that doesn't necessarily always come naturally to practice.
Thank you. Thanks.
I'm going to read out a question next from Constance. So who's asked me to read it out. And it's for Thomas. So loose fit infrastructure considered, I think as you referred to it, absent space by the official body. Do you mean as there is no permanent architecture, or is there another meaning to absent space for you? Is there an absent to fluent aspect? Sorry, is there an aspect to fluent space? Fluent space, yeah. I might have read that out slightly wrong. Let me just see if Constance is there just to ask that last bit of question.
Hi, sorry, I've just got my dog squeaking in the background, so that's why I asked you to read it out, but he's quiet now. So it was just that slide with the train tracks, and you're saying that they are not considered a official space in any capacity, that it's kind of absent space. But you were saying that there's stuff going on and there's things happening, so that would you consider that maybe fluent space? I think you had another word for it. I don't remember what you said, temporary space or something like that?
Okay, yeah. So I suppose I described this railway corridor as a slow-moving market space, but that I think I maybe described it as an interstitial zone. So what I meant by that is not so much that there was an absence of architecture or that there was an absence of space necessarily, but it was that there was an absence of clear control, and particularly city and authoritative control. Although that's changed in recent time. And so to kind of reflect back to Precious's question as well about time, what's really interesting about that photograph, which was taken, I think, in the year 2015 or 2016, it showed a moment in time where the city authority were starting to consider forms of eviction and ways of what they would class decongesting the city. And so in a way, I think to kind of reflect on both questions, one would be to constantly take a photograph in the same location over time, but also to make sure projects are always reflective of that period. So in a way that there's not, so in a way, and I think hopefully this is also something I try to attempt to do, is to make something that reflects that moment very specifically, in the way that, for example, talking about Whitechapel High Street today was very much about July 2020. And in a sense, like, you know, if I was allowed to leave my house, I would have probably tried to have, you know, done a version in March 2021. But to go back to, or to return to Kampala, I think I was very interested in the marginalized population of the city, and by that particularly people who deal in the city's small margins, and so where people's lives, I suppose, sort of exist in a kind of state of uncertainty. And so what I found on the railway tracks were a congregation of vendors, cobblers, tailors, fruit sellers, barbers, blacksmiths, retailers, and that in a way they sort of transform what is seemingly an absent space into an incredibly saturated landscape, full of interaction, and they facilitate this trade. Is that a good way to answer that, or is there something else? Is there a second part to the question?
No, it was just, I just thought it was very interesting. And I think you were also talking about, you know, how later on, you were moving through space and how space changes over time, obviously. And, you know, making maybe things a bit more temporary rather than very permanent and very fixed. And just, I think it's like the migrant thing that Hani was talking about as well, that like you can't really, you know, you have to have this flexibility and you have to have this openness to be able to adapt things and not to have this kind of very set mindset, you know, like just be very focused on one specific, you know, thing, but just be able to adapt things. And I think that's, I just thought it was a very good image and very interesting. And as you said, that it's changed a lot now with the official authorities coming in and kind of making some changes. And I thought that was very interesting. Thank you.
And just to add on that, I mean, I think there's going to be there's an interesting tension that's now existing between the city authority and the people dealing in the small margins, and you know, and that term of resilience is kind of critical to that. And you know, it's a kind of cat and mouse game. You know, it's don't rule out the small margins. Constanza, your sky is amazing, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Yes, we just had a really good London sunset after horrible rain all day. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
Okay, we've had a question from Alicia Fisher, but she's very sorry she can't talk right now. But we can imagine her reading this question out, as she is a friend of us. So, what have you learned the most about the process of rest as the practice? What have you learned most about the practice during the pandemic, and how can we continue to push the narrative of Black empowerment and celebration within our spaces? To Amara, I have a background. No, I can't read that last bit. So I got dyslexia. Sometimes it comes up like this. Anyway, yeah. So how can we push the narrative of Black empowerment and celebration of our spaces? Amara, maybe go first. Yeah.
That is a great question, because I feel in many ways. Also, hey Alicia, hey girl. I feel in many ways that that we are constantly, you know, talking about space creation. We are constantly building in with for our communities. I would almost, if I could be in conversation with you, and I'm sure we will be soon, Alicia, it's for what purpose would we want to be you know, elevating that narrative. I think in lots of ways, I'm trying to be really mindful about the conversations that I'm participating in, and the fight that I'm committed to. I've been on this journey recently where for example, I don't want to be speaking about anti-racist practice in the built environment. I have no interest in that. I want to be talking about what do we stand for? What are we fighting for? Like, what are we showing up for in the world? I want to have conversations about Black liberation. In many ways, I think I think Thomas brought it up, the events recently with the devastating murder of Sarah Everard, has shown that there is a demand that's being made, or a series of demands that are being made in the wake of that passing, that Black people have also been calling for. How do we hold people accountable? What is the relationship between the police force and citizens and people of the world? What is that relationship? What are the other potentials of that? How do we, you know, minimize the possibility for harm to be possible? In many ways, you know, Black organizers, Black people have been fighting for that, because we fundamentally know that, I think this is the point that Hani, in fact, both of you probably touched on in your projects, but that from the center to the margins and from the margins to the center, we know that if we have centered our practice on Black liberation, on queer liberation, on migrant liberation, everybody benefits. So it's really difficult to be in a conversation and saying, what do Black people need to do in order to really raise that, when it's like, we're always making these demands. I really appreciate, like, I know a lot of Alicia's work is very much about that collectivism. And I think that this is something that I definitely see as, for me, I talk a lot about ancestral wisdom, ancestral learning, and part of that survival, but also capacity to thrive, was rooted in collective dynamics. So I think there's as many ways as possible that we can remove from the singular, that we remove from the individual, that we remove from that sort of like heroic and personal narrative, which is extremely Eurocentric, the more as a collective society we'll be able to flourish.
Thank you, Mar. That's brilliant. I'm going to actually ask China to read out her question next, which is another question from Mar, and I think follows on really nicely. So I'm going to just ask her to unmute, and I hope she'll kindly read it out.
Oh gosh.
China.
Hi everyone.
Hi, China.
Yes.
Oh God, I wasn't expecting my face to look like this, but I'm just going to carry on.
Lovely.
Okay, my question is a bit confusing, and I've probably not articulated it properly enough for like James to understand, but I'm going to try my best. But basically, in working towards like social value, I think my question is kind of like for Amara, because you're an artist and I'm like aiming to become an architect, but like as I'm on this journey, I'm like, oh, it's a bit hard to actually do the things that I want to do, because as an architect we need like an appointment, and we have to have a very specific sort of like roles that we play that we then get paid for. And I was just wondering if like being an artist kind of like frees you up in like being able to sort of make these changes, but at the same time, how do you then balance that in relation to like, you know, what you decide to your services and what is you just being you and helping out? Because like sometimes I'm doing work in like adventure playgrounds and I'm like, I'll stay 2 hours longer and just play with these kids a bit longer, but that's just me. Like, but at the same time I might learn from like their lived experiences because I'm there like spending time with them. So yeah, it's a bit of a blur.
Such a powerful line of inquiry that I feel like in you asking me, I'm probably the worst possible person to be like, because there's a conversation that feels like there's a piece about boundaries in socially rooted work that feels really important. And then there's another conversation that when something is your lived experience, your embodiment, your personality, and that is part of the reason why you want to be in this work, how do you hold those things to be true? And then the other part of your line of thought is very much about there are some technicalities, there are some codes, there are some, you know, there's a trajectory and there's a journey to being an architect, and actually being an artist might be a bit more freeing. And sometimes I'm like, I don't actually know if it is. The codes might be different. Like, do you know, I'm in this mode of really trying to explore language a lot, and even that, you know, our mission at Maya is to reimagine and reclaim what it means to be an artist. And we're thinking so much about how that is, I call the manifestations of the radical imagination art. That the radical imagination has birthed, I have Caribbean heritage, right? So I look at my granddad, and when he makes dumpling, I'm like, yo, that is the most radical thing I've ever seen in my life. What an art form, you know, like, wow. Radical imagination has birthed so many things. It has birthed, you know, what we think of as traditional, you know, music and artistry, but it's also birthed incredible systems. It's birthed things like land systems that are very, very real. It's birthed things like architectures. It has birthed all of these things. So I'm interested in the duality of terms. I think of myself as an artist and a spatial practitioner, but also this idea that art is a spatial practice in itself. And I think about my journey as a performance artist. I'm a drama graduate. I survived. But you know, that practice is very much about world building. That practice is about systems design, and how do the characters within that world relate to the spaces. I also did a lot of set design. That was my sort of first entry into the profession. So it's rooted in sort of like, you know, spatial practice in that way, which then comes with a whole load of regulations and all these things that may not be in the same. I feel like this is the conversation we should just have. Like, we need to have this conversation outside, because I don't want to take up everybody's time, but I would love to explore that further. I think what I'm trying to say is your line of thought is something that I'm deeply resonating with as well. Okay, you ain't alone, honey.
Yeah, it'll be nice to have a chat. Thank you. That was like, you answered it to a certain degree, so thank you.
Just to also add a little bit onto that, I think that for us as well, we've been thinking, obviously, because of the events of the last couple of years have been very, they've required a lot of emotional labor to both deal with and then also to kind of work through. And I think that one thing that we've been thinking about actively within, like I mentioned this very, very loosely when I talked about having to do a lot of work internally and externally. And it's not just about defining your words, but also defining your boundaries and understanding that there needs to be, first of all, there needs to be an accountability to the kind of ethics that you hold for yourself, but then also an understanding that that you cannot, it's not about sacrificing your well-being and entirety of your sanity and your health just for the sake of liberation. Like, liberation is also about, like Amara was saying, it's about rest. It's about making sure that you have boundaries and you have these kind of points where you say, okay, I understand that this is something that needs to be done, but we also need to make sure we look after each other. Because realistically speaking, you know, when you talk about the people in the communities that you serve, these are people who are either have experienced generational trauma or are experiencing trauma on the everyday basis, whether that is through kind of like violence through the city or urban violence, or whether that is through kind of like just violence of being and having to kind of negotiate these difficult sort of complex social norms and expectations. So like it can be sometimes, it's very important to keep those boundaries in place, because you can give almost too much of yourself away and end up sort of being worse off and not being able to help anyone long term. So there's a lot of and it's very difficult to deal with and understand, but like that's one thing that we've been actively working on, is like, how do we, and it's also about like making sure that you demystify, or not even demystify, but like actively work on bringing conversations about well-being and bringing conversations about you know, how are you feeling? Like, it's such an important question, and we try to center that within how we kind of work, and we try to take that into account. Because if you're working on you know, if you're working on liberation, if you're working on your own time, that's something that you can do. You don't have to emulate structures where you work on 9 to 5 and you do like all these late hours, you know. So
I think that point about accountability as well, it's so easy to then merge into being 24/7 available to your community, and then having to be like counselor, parent, architect sometimes, you know, like that full that I think what you're saying, Hani, about boundary setting and the point that you raised, China, about boundaries is so important. But I've been having a conversation with a dear friend of mine, Soraya, who's in an organizer and activist, and she was like, capitalism really wants us to work in this way and will be really happy for you to like basically kill yourself to work, to be you know, a producer of work and labor. And actually at any point you can turn around and be like, I think I'm done now. And when she said it, I was like, oh my God, I can do that.
Yeah.
That's good. I mean, I've actually also got a question that I'd quite like to ask the panel, and it's kind of around, I suppose, when we're looking at interdisciplinary design, or when we're looking at new forms of practice, I feel like different skills are required. It feels like there needs to be something about being prepared to listen to other people, finding new ways to make use of social media potentially, contact people that you otherwise wouldn't have thought to message, and sort of how we can make kind of connections which potentially allow different forms of different people. And I suppose thinking in terms of an architect, what does this maybe the next generation of architect look like? Is it, and what skills will they have? So Thomas has put his hand up first, so let's go. Thomas, yeah.
Well, I suppose what I wanted to do by speaking about the practice of walking was suggest that if you focus and engage on the way your early processes of engaging a city or a street, or challenging or deconstructing a brief, then you can generate a type of architecture and an architectural identity that I think reflects closer to your intentions. You know, so to the, you know, hopefully the kind of liberating ideas that we've spoken about, particularly Amara, you know, that can be kind of defined early on, and if you kind of think critically about your processes. And you identified listening. You know, I spoke about walking. You know, we're keeping it really really, you know, pared back here, but in a way it's like, if you challenge the criticality of those things, if you don't just you know, if you tell yourself when you're going to walk, you're going to do it far, you're going to do it you're going to do it often, you're going to be observant, and that becomes a mantra, then I think you can actually fundamentally change the way that you both engage the city, but also the way that you design architecture.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And the point about the pared back, like, you know, the basic elementary things. I think this, sometimes I think there's like the surface layer of, like, when we talk about listening, proximity really matters, right? Like sometimes we're like, yeah, I'm listening to the community, but are you hearing them? Sometimes when people are like, oh, I heard them, but it's like, but are you listening though? Because, you know, the proximity meant that I could have, for example, gone to my community and said, what would you really like this space to be? And they might have had ideas, but actually the society that we live in, the powers that govern our society stifle the imagination. Sometimes you don't know what you want, but you know you want something different to what is. And the listening part really informs us. This is a line of inquiry that they're exploring right now. So all the hustlers on Snapchat were like, I'm out here making my little seafood boil bags. Like, active listening said, okay, well, can we use some resource to invest in whatever that next step might be? And the other thing I just wanted to say on this, on what the future of architects, I did a series on my Instagram called The Man Them as Planners. And I was talking about, well, if the man them were planners, how would that manifest in radical shift in transport and infrastructure? How would that shift in how we're thinking about environmental justice and all that kind of stuff? And actually we realized that the wisdoms are already entailed in a lot of the communities that currently exist. So I definitely want to just echo that point about what you both were saying then.
What give us three things that the man them said?
All right, let me. I'm gonna read it out for you. Once again, let me find it real quick. So, if the man them were planners, black boys on bikes wouldn't be policed. The Lycra cyclists wouldn't be the only ones praised for their climate-saving choices. Only public transport users would design public transport. Man them and uncles know back roads more than anyone. Mandem design transit routes so buses don't go through hoods in conflict. That was sort of like the transport infrastructure bit. And there's like loads more, but I'm really interested in what would happen if, you know, we literally give the powers and say, like, you want to do this thing where you are, what would that look like? And then we just like, okay, well, as an architect, you know, that's what you would do. The fun experiment.
Yeah, I think just on the listening thing, I think it's just about going into a space and accepting that it's not about you. Like, you just go in and listen to what the community says and engage in an honest conversation with what they want. Because like Amara, like you're saying, there's already a lot of embodied knowledge in local communities. And Thomas, like you're saying as well, it's that these communities sort of reconfigure themselves and adapt and kind of improvise, right? Which, like, you know, we don't want to like overly like flowery kind of like over romanticize it too much, but like there is an element of survival that requires that. So it's about respecting that and understanding that, but also facilitating their improvement and their flourishment within at their own pace and their own time. And if I'm like and how does an architect fit into that? I don't really know. Like, are architects really going to be that deeply involved in the future with this kind of stuff? Because you know, architects at the moment, I feel have their hands somewhat tied in terms of how much power does an architect really have if they're in a position where they're not able to either influence policy meaningfully, if they're not able to, and you know, if we're going to talk about it, like the framework that architects operate in will be strongly influenced by policy. So do you need architects to step outside of that? Do you need architects to be able to think about how can an architect really actually be effectively used as a tool for social change when they can't really, you know, they can have conversations with the client, but how much power does that give them? So I know it's maybe a bad time to drop this with 2 minutes to go to the end of the discussion, but I think that just to kind of put it in a way that I think maybe everyone can think about is like, think about what can an architect do for a community, and can they do it in the framework of this part 1 to 3? Can they do it, or can they do it without? Like, what does the architect really need to be able to facilitate the community? Because communities have had architects without these titles for a really long time. If you look at, I think something like 10, maybe 10% is being generous, but 10% of the buildings of the whole world are built with architects. So, like, what purpose can architects serve? And then I think maybe that can lead into some of the identity crisis that architecture as an industry and as a profession has been having, and start to ask really like quite heavy but important questions. What and I'm not going to say we, because I don't count myself for that anymore, but what are architects going to do? So I'm going to leave on that. So.
Thank you very much, Hani. Just before we finished, I'd really like to invite Ektorus to, he has a question. I'd just also like to invite him to speak on. So Ektorus is part of the Now What team who's kind of put on these talks, and he's also part of the history module. And we've had a few questions also about how we can ensure our history modules really interrogate architecture history. So I'm just going to invite Ektorus, who might want to say something else, but let's just invite him in. Unmute now. Hello, Ektorus. Can I hear you?
Can't hear.
I hear you, actually. No audio. Okay, I'll maybe read out your question. Shall I read out your question?
Ektorus, I know what it's like. Don't worry. What you're feeling right now is not the technological meltdown that I had earlier.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, Ektorus, I don't think we're going to hear you, unfortunately.
I feel like that was such a beautiful build-up as well. I didn't know what the question was.
I know, okay. So I will ask the question. So it's for Amara, and the question reads, thank you, amazing talk. Hearing about the hotel, which is current, temporary, fleeting, and about lineage for which you look deep back in time, made me wonder how you reconcile these two temporalities in practical terms. I find it quite admirable that you're able to deal with both and switch from one to another.
Thank you so much.
That's a good question, but yeah.
In the quickest way possible to sum up this, I'm currently geeking out about, bear with me, intergenerational time travel. Stick with me if you can. I'm really interested in this, the role of embodiment and ancestral wisdom and how that channels through people, how it channels through space. I'm really interested in the memory of space, the memory of body memory and somatics. And I think that there's something about that there's almost like a subconscious way in which I'm navigating that in the creation of that space. I think this idea, it comes back to previous questions about temporality. It was something that for a really long time I've been trying to resist, like our communities deserve permanence and da 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 da, when actually, you know, the land justice inquiry is forcing me to reimagine my relationship with land, and actually how, if for example we are to abolish all that currently governs land systems and are to get into right relationship with land and therefore space and therefore architecture, how would that relationship be completely transformed? And so you only have temporality, you only have nomadic, you only have moving, you only have the fleeting, fleeing nature, because that's such a real experience for our communities now. If we think about migrant communities, if we think about poor communities who are cleansed and displaced from places, if we think about how geography affects where people are, and of course climate change and how that's only going to exacerbate further. We're currently living through temporality but not intentionally designing for it. So it's something that I'm really really consciously fascinated by at the moment. I would love to talk to you about intergenerational time travel.
Thank you so much. And I'm not sure if any of the other speakers would like to pick up on that idea of time. And talking about time, I'm also conscious that we're out of time. So I'm going to run a bit of a risk and invite anyone, like, since we're already 3 minutes past time, we may as well make it 5. So if anyone has any final points, or would like to, if the panel would like to raise any points or ask any questions to each other, or bring anything, any points of discussion that haven't come up yet onto the table, you're very, very welcome to do so. That puts you a bit on the spot, sorry.
I just want to thank you all for the work that you're leading, and collectively, these are the things that keep me hopeful, and keep us going through really difficult times. So yeah, thank you so much.
Can I echo that? I think you're doing great work. I think now what is a really important provocation, and hopefully, you know, extends last year's moment of global visibility. I think you're doing it, you know, at the kind of, you know, to use Hani's term, you're doing it at the translocal level, and hopefully that can, you know, this series can stretch beyond just this year and for multiple years. Keep it up, and thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, I mean, I just going to join in at the end of that. Yeah, thank you. This is really great. I would advise anyone who is thinking about what they can do for communities, or if they're thinking about how they can help people, to maybe investigate things and investigate words and phrases and sort of terminology and structures, and think about where your position is relative to these things, as well as also just listening. It's a very long process, and yeah, conversations are the first place to go, and the second reading is the second. So thank you, Lucia, thank you, James, and thank you everyone for coming as well. And yeah.
Thank you so incredibly much for joining us and for talking about everything so generously. I'm not sure if we end the session by clapping or if we just imagine that we're all clapping in a room.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.